Every difficult relationship in your life has one thing in common. Sooner or later, it comes down to a conversation. Not a perfect conversation, not a magical line that fixes everything, but one ordinary moment when you either react from habit or respond with intention. Jefferson Fisher's The Next Conversation is built around that exact idea. It argues that most of us are not losing connection because we lack intelligence. We are losing connection because we enter tense moments too fast, too defensive, too eager to win, or too afraid to say what we really mean. And before we go further, if you care about your own growth and want more expert summaries from the world's most influential authors, take a second to like, share, and comment on this video. It helps this channel keep building a library of ideas that are actually useful when life gets hard. What makes this book compelling is that Fisher does not approach communication as abstract theory. He writes as a trial lawyer, a speaker, and a communication educator whose central promise is practical transformation. Say it with control, say it with confidence, and say it to connect. The book was published in March 2025, runs just over 300 pages, and is organized around a clear progression from foundations to application. It begins by changing how you think about conflict itself, then moves into the inner mechanics of emotional control, then into confidence, boundaries, defensiveness, and the structure of hard conversations, before closing with a reminder that real communication is not about sounding impressive, but about being clear and human. That architecture matters, because this is not a bag of random tips. It is a system designed to change who you are in the moment before words leave your mouth. The emotional starting point of the book comes from Fisher's own life. In the prologue, he traces his fascination with communication back to family stories, courtroom language, and the experience of watching how voice, timing, and tone shape what people feel. He also describes learning to navigate everyday conflict long before professional life, in ordinary family dynamics, where being heard, calming tension, and reading emotion mattered. That opening matters because it frames communication not as a corporate skill or debate trick, but as a deeply human inheritance. The book's underlying claim is that every family, every workplace, every friendship, and every partnership is shaped by spoken patterns, whether we notice them or not. Fisher is essentially saying that conversations are not side events in life. They are the mechanism through which life gets built. From there, the book makes its first strong move: stop trying to win arguments. Fisher opens the main section by challenging the instinct to treat conflict like a contest. His point is not that truth does not matter, or that every disagreement should dissolve into softness. His point is that when your goal becomes victory, the relationship usually loses. You may score a momentary point, but you often sacrifice trust, openness, and the chance to understand what is really happening underneath the other person's words. In Fisher's framing, arguments often run on surface language, while the real fuel is elsewhere: fear, shame, grief, pressure, ego, or old pain. So, the first shift the book asks for is profound. Instead of asking, "How do I win this?" ask, "What is this moment really about?" That question changes everything, because now you are listening for the emotion under the sentence, not just the sentence itself. A little later, in the opening movement of the book, Fisher introduces one of the ideas that gives the entire work its title and its emotional momentum. The next conversation matters more than the fantasy version in your head. He argues that many people sabotage difficult discussions before they begin, by rehearsing imaginary speeches, constructing courtroom arguments, or chasing a perfect script that reality will never follow. The better preparation, he says, is not scripting every sentence. It is deciding who you want to be when the moment arrives. What values do you want to bring? Calm, honesty, courage, kindness, steadiness, clarity? Instead of controlling the other person's response, prepare your own posture. This is where I want to invite a quick ritual that fits the book perfectly. Comment, I choose clarity. It is short, easy, and it captures the spirit of this whole summary, because Fisher's message is not about sounding clever. It is about showing up clear. Another quiet strength of the book's opening is that Fisher does not present communication as merely verbal. Again and again, he treats it as emotional interpretation. In other words, he asks readers to notice what they are hearing themselves say, but also what another person may be trying and failing to say cleanly. That is why his anti-winning argument is more nuanced than it first appears. He is not calling for softness at any cost. He is calling for discernment. Sometimes the harsh sentence in front of you is not the real issue. Sometimes a person is using anger to carry humiliation, or certainty to hide insecurity, or blame to avoid grief. Fisher keeps inviting the reader to hear beneath the performance. That does not excuse bad behavior, but it can stop us from misdiagnosing the moment. That same early section also draws a distinction between sending information and creating connection. Fisher suggests that modern life makes us overestimate the power of transmission. We text, email, post, and reply constantly, so it becomes easy to assume that if words were delivered, understanding happened. But the book insists that connection is something deeper. It is not merely that a message arrived, it is that another person felt seen, heard, and acknowledged. That is why so many conversations fail, even when the facts are technically present. A person can hear your point and still feel untouched by you. They can read your sentence and still miss your intention. Fisher treats connection as something built through presence, not just content. This becomes especially important in emotionally loaded settings, because when tension rises, people stop listening only for meaning. They start listening for threat, disrespect, dismissal, blame, or warmth. Once the foundations are in place, the book shifts inward and says something many communication guides ignore. You cannot speak well when your body has already gone to war. This is where Fisher's framework becomes less about phrasing and more about self-regulation. He describes an ignition phase, that instant where emotion starts taking over and reaction becomes faster than judgment. In everyday life, this might look like your chest tightening, your jaw locking, your thoughts racing, or your tone sharpening before you have consciously chosen anything. Fisher's argument is that better communication starts earlier than we think. It starts at the level of physiology. If you do not notice your own ignition, you will mistake your emotional surge for truth and your impulse for wisdom. The book therefore treats self-control not as repression, but as awareness. Notice what is happening in you before you try to manage what is happening between you and someone else. The chapters on control also deserve more credit than they usually get in pop communication books, because they are really about dignity under stress. Fisher is telling readers that if they do not understand their own physical escalation, they will keep confusing activation with authority. Many people think they are finally being honest, when in reality, they are just flooded. That confusion leads to some of the worst communication we have, the speech that feels righteous in the moment and regrettable an hour later. By naming ignition, Fisher gives readers a way to catch themselves earlier. That is not small. It means you can start to recognize that your racing thoughts, sharp tone, and need to interrupt may not be evidence that you are right. They may be evidence that you are overwhelmed. To help with that, Fisher gives readers a set of practical tools for controlling the moment before it controls them. One is a deliberate calming breath designed to interrupt escalation. Another is a quick internal scan that asks, in effect, what am I feeling? Where is it showing up in my body? And what state am I bringing into this exchange? Another is what he calls a form of personal self-talk, a short phrase rooted in values that steadies you before speaking. The deeper point behind all of these tools is that preparation matters more than improvisation. Most people think control means staying composed after the argument starts. Fisher pushes the timeline backward. Real control begins before the sentence, before the rebuttal, before the eye roll, before the interruption. It begins in the private second where you decide not to hand your nervous system the steering wheel. His emphasis on breath, scanning, and grounding phrases can sound simple, but that simplicity is part of the design. Fisher seems to understand that most people will not remember complex theories when a real argument is unfolding. They need tools that can survive pressure. A quick breath. A quick scan. A short internal phrase. Those are usable. More importantly, they pull communication out of the purely intellectual realm and back into embodied practice. You are not just trying to think better thoughts. You are trying to lower internal heat so your better thoughts have a chance to appear. That is one reason the book lands so well with readers who are tired of elegant theories that collapse in real life. Fisher is trying to meet people where conversations actually break down. Then he adds another underused tool, pace. Fisher argues that silence is not weakness, awkwardness, or a conversational failure. Used correctly, it is a form of power. A short pause can make you sound thoughtful instead of reactive. A longer pause can lower the emotional temperature of the room and create enough space for honesty to enter. This matters because many people have been trained, culturally or professionally, to equate speed with competence. The faster answer wins. The quicker comeback dominates. The instant defense proves strength. Fisher rejects that rhythm. He suggests that credibility often rises when speed falls. Slowing down helps you choose words, regulate tone, and avoid adding fresh damage to an already charged moment. In that sense, the book is quietly countercultural. It tells readers to step out of urgency and reclaim timing as part of their voice. After control, the book moves into confidence. But again, Fisher avoids the usual self-help cliché. Confidence, in his view, is not a mood you wait for. It is something built through assertive action. You become more confident by speaking more clearly, not by waiting until fear disappears. This is one of the most useful pivots in the book because it rescues communication from perfectionism. You do not need to feel fully ready to sound more grounded. You start practicing the behaviors that embody steadiness, and your self-trust rises from that practice. Fisher's version of assertiveness sits between passivity and aggression. It is not silence, and it is not domination. It is respectful directness. It is the ability to state a need, express a view, or hold a line without collapsing into apology or exploding into force. The assertiveness material becomes even more valuable when you realize Fisher is not simply upgrading vocabulary. He is changing self-permission. People who constantly qualify their statements are often doing more than speaking softly. They are asking for permission to exist in the conversation. That is why his advice about dropping unnecessary softness, reducing filler, and replacing excessive apology with gratitude matters. It is less about style than status. Fisher is helping readers stop subconsciously placing themselves beneath their own message. His point is not that every softener is bad, or that communication should become blunt and sterile. His point is that habitual self-diminishing language trains both speaker and listener to treat the speaker's meaning as negotiable before it has even been expressed. That chapter on assertive voice gets very practical. Fisher advises people to reduce qualifying language that weakens their message, the little verbal habits that make statements sound unsure before the real thought has even landed. He challenges filler words, cluttered phrasing, and over-softening. He emphasizes that directness does not make a person rude. Often, it makes them easier to trust. He also links communication to integrity. If your words constantly shrink from what you really mean, you teach yourself not to trust your own voice. He encourages more honest need language, stronger tone control, and body language that matches the message. What is useful here is that he is not selling charisma. He is teaching congruence. The goal is not to sound flashy. It is to make your words line up with your intention. And around this point in the book, the message almost dares the reader to ask whether they have been using politeness to hide from clarity. Midway through the book, Fisher turns toward one of the situations people care about most: difficult people. This is where his framework becomes especially practical, because empathy alone cannot solve every interaction. Some people provoke, bait, belittle, manipulate, interrupt, or twist language in ways that make ordinary goodwill ineffective. Fisher does not say you must outfight them. He says you must stop giving them easy access to your reactivity. One memorable tactic he discusses is asking someone to repeat a cruel or disrespectful remark. That move is powerful because it shifts the emotional burden back to the speaker without matching aggression with aggression. It creates a moment of exposure. Instead of absorbing the blow and responding impulsively, you hold up a mirror. That is typical of Fisher's style. Not domination, not surrender, but a calm repositioning of the exchange. That same principle explains why the chapter on difficult people is so resonant. What makes those interactions exhausting is not merely that someone is rude. It is that rude or manipulative people often pull you out of your own center and into their theater. Suddenly, you are defending, proving, justifying, or emotionally chasing. Fisher's methods are designed to break that gravity. Ask the person to repeat themselves. Question the intention of a remark. Refuse the bait of fake apologies or cheap escalation. Use calm language that does not surrender your dignity. What he is really teaching is non-participation in emotional chaos. He is not saying you can control the difficult person. He is saying you can stop volunteering as a supporting actor in their performance. He also challenges bad apology language, vague blame, and reflexive counterattacks. Rather than meeting sarcasm with sarcasm, he pushes toward calmer questions, clearer corrections, and language that protects dignity. Even disagreement can be reframed. Instead of throwing down verbal weapons, he prefers perspective language that leaves room for dialogue. This matters because the book understands that tone determines whether disagreement becomes exploration or combat. At the same time, a balanced reading of the book should note something important. Fisher's tools are strongest in everyday personal and professional conflict, not as a full safety manual for abusive or coercive environments. In situations of serious manipulation, threat, or structural power imbalance, clarity still matters, but safety may matter more. The book hints at this boundary, and it is worth keeping in mind as we move through its advice. From difficult people, Fisher naturally moves to boundaries, and here the book becomes especially strong. He argues that many people were not trained to keep boundaries. They were trained to protect comfort, avoid disappointment, and remain available. Over time, that creates adults who feel guilty saying no, who over-explain simple limits, and who quietly resent the access others demand from them. Fisher reframes boundaries as a form of respect, not punishment. A boundary is not an attack on another person. It is clarity about what you will and will not participate in. That clarity, he suggests, is what allows relationships to stay honest. Without boundaries, connection becomes contaminated by exhaustion and resentment. The chapter on boundaries deepens that lesson by moving from reaction to structure. It is one thing to respond well in a single tense moment. It is another thing to build a life where certain patterns do not keep recycling because your limits are finally visible. Fisher's idea of a boundary manual is especially useful because it helps readers turn vague discomfort into defined policy. What exactly do I no longer engage with? What tone ends the conversation? What repeated pattern no longer earns another explanation? These questions move a person from emotional confusion to self-respect. They also reveal one of the book's strongest implicit claims. Resentment is often a boundary problem before it becomes a relationship problem. The practical formula he offers is deceptively simple. Say no, express gratitude, and end with kindness. That pattern matters because it keeps the message firm without turning it cold. In more serious situations, however, Fisher goes further. He encourages people to create a kind of personal manual, an internal list of non-negotiables that defines how they will respond to yelling, manipulation, disrespect, or repeated violation. This is powerful because it takes boundary setting out of pure improvisation. You do not wait until you are flooded to decide what you stand for. You know in advance. And if a line is crossed, the book argues for naming the consequence and following through. That is the part many people skip. They announce a limit, but they do not enforce it. Fisher insists that without follow-through, the boundary becomes a wish instead of a structure. If that idea hits home, drop a second quick comment. I stand firm. It matches the book's boundary language beautifully. The next major turn in the book is structure, which Fisher calls framing. This chapter is easy to underestimate, but it may be one of the most valuable parts of the system. His argument is that many conversations fail, not because the people involved are terrible, but because the conversation has no frame. There is no clear topic, no clear goal, no shared sense of what this exchange is for, and no consent around when or how it is happening. So, the conversation sprawls, mutates, and drifts into old wounds or side arguments. Fisher's solution is to frame the discussion clearly. Name what this conversation is about, explain what outcome you hope for, and make sure the other person is able and willing to engage. That sounds simple, but in real life, it changes the emotional texture of a conversation almost immediately. Framing, too, has wider power than it first appears to. In many families and workplaces, people try to have emotionally significant conversations in structurally careless ways. They launch into criticism in passing. They bury the main point under side stories. They stack 5 complaints into one moment. They raise high-stakes issues when the other person is distracted, exhausted, or trapped. Then they blame the communication itself when the real problem was poor setup. Fisher's framing advice restores intentionality. By naming the topic, the hoped-for outcome, and the right moment, he is not scripting the conversation into artificiality. He is building a container strong enough to hold honesty. That matters because many conversations fail before the first real sentence even lands. A frame lowers confusion. It tells the other person where we are going and why. It prevents that sinking feeling people get when they realize they have wandered into a serious conversation without preparation. It also helps the speaker avoid turning one issue into 10. Fisher repeatedly favors one issue, one direction, one outcome. When the conversation drifts, the frame can gently pull it back. This becomes especially useful in work settings, in family conflict, and in emotionally loaded relationships where people carry entire archives of unresolved material into a single exchange. Framing does not make a conversation rigid. It makes it navigable. And if you have already gotten value from this summary, this is a good place to like, share, and comment, because ideas like this are the ones that change how people walk into their next hard conversation. From framing, the book moves into defensiveness, which Fisher treats as one of the most common destroyers of good dialogue. His key insight is that defensiveness is rarely about logic. It is usually about perceived threat. When people feel accused, exposed, diminished, or cornered, they defend identity before they address content. That is why conversations that look factual on the surface can become emotionally chaotic so quickly. Fisher encourages readers to notice the signs: blame shifting, generalized attacks, sarcasm, the need to explain everything at once, the urge to say, "you always," or "that's not what happened." These moves feel protective in the moment, but they usually damage clarity and connection. His antidote is curiosity. Replace blame-heavy you language with I language. Ask questions that open rather than corner. He is especially wary of why questions in tense moments, because they can sound prosecutorial even when the speaker thinks they are being reasonable. He prefers forms of inquiry that invite explanation rather than defense. Just as important, he recommends acknowledging the other person before pressing your own point. That does not mean surrendering your position. It means lowering the temperature enough for a real exchange to happen. One of the strongest themes running through the book appears here again. You do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. That principle is bigger than rhetoric. It is identity. It is the decision not to let every emotional provocation define your behavior. In the final main chapter, Fisher gathers the whole system into a framework for hard conversations themselves. These are the talks people postpone for weeks or months: breakups, corrective feedback, terminations, painful truths, overdue honesty, and emotionally expensive conversations inside close relationships. Fisher's claim is that the difficulty often comes less from the subject than from the way people approach it. They choose bad timing, hide behind polite filler, delay the point, or spring a serious topic on someone whose emotional bandwidth is already gone. So he recommends 3 major adjustments. First, schedule with intention. Second, do not bury the seriousness under fake casualness. Third, lead with the outcome. By the time the book reaches difficult conversations, that whole philosophy comes together. Fisher wants readers to stop treating honesty as an ambush, a delayed explosion, or a performance of emotional strain. He wants truth delivered with preparation, context, and courage. Scheduling matters because human beings need bandwidth. Direct openings matter because unclear softness can feel more frightening than hard honesty. Leading with the outcome matters because people deserve to know what conversation they are actually in. And becoming a safe receiver matters because no one can build a culture of honest speech if every difficult truth gets punished. This is where the book becomes larger than individual technique. It becomes a vision for healthier relational culture, whether in a marriage, a family, a team, or a company. That last point is especially important. Most people circle around the hard truth because they hope to reduce the impact. But often that increases anxiety because the listener feels the tension before understanding it. Fisher favors respectful directness. This is going to be hard. Say what the conversation is about. Say the main point without making the other person wait through a fog of preamble. In his view, clarity is kindness. He also reminds readers that being on the receiving end of a difficult conversation is its own skill. If you want people to be honest with you, become safer to tell the truth to. Do not interrupt vulnerability with self-defense. Do not force immediate resolution. Sometimes, the most important response is a simple acknowledgement that the other person trusted you enough to say something hard. What makes the book more than a collection of tips is the consistency of its moral center. Across all these chapters, Fisher keeps returning to the same deeper lesson. Communication is character under pressure. The goal is not merely to say the right line. The goal is to become the kind of person who can remain grounded when the stakes rise. That is why the book keeps returning to values. Instead of obsessively scripting, Fisher prefers anchoring. What kind of person do I want to be in this conversation? Honest, calm, respectful, firm, compassionate. That orientation gives the whole system coherence. The techniques serve the values. The phrases serve the posture. The posture serves the relationship, or where necessary, the protection of your own peace. There is also a quiet social dimension in the book that deserves attention. Although Fisher writes for a broad popular audience, several of his themes touch realities bigger than individual habit. Communication confidence is shaped by upbringing, culture, class, gendered expectations, family roles, and previous experiences of being ignored or punished for speaking. The book is not a sociological treatise, but it repeatedly acknowledges that some people have learned to soften themselves for safety or belonging. That gives extra weight to his ideas about assertiveness, boundary setting, and reducing apology-driven speech. Read charitably. The book is trying to hand ordinary readers a form of grounded self-respect. Not ego. Not dominance. Not verbal superiority. Just the ability to stand in one's own voice without becoming cruel or collapsing into fear. That broader human concern becomes clearest in the afterword. Fisher closes with a courtroom story about a man worried not only about testifying, but about how his voice, language, and presentation will be judged. It is a fitting ending because it strips away the fantasy that communication excellence belongs only to the polished and educated. Fisher's closing lesson is that communication is not about performance in the glamorous sense. It is about presence, truth, and the courage to speak from where you really are. He applies the same tools from the rest of the book, not to make someone sound fancy, but to help someone sound like themselves without fear. That is a beautiful ending for this kind of book, because it reveals the emotional heart beneath all the tactics. The point is not to become a more impressive talker. The point is to become a more grounded human being in relationship. So what is the full message of the next conversation when you step back and see the whole architecture? It is that better conversations are not accidents. They are built. First, stop worshiping the idea of winning. Then, stop over-scripting and start anchoring in values. Learn the difference between information and connection. Notice your ignition before it hijacks the room. Control your breath, your pace, and your nervous system. Practice an assertive voice instead of waiting for confidence to fall from the sky. Handle difficult people without handing them your center. Build boundaries that protect your peace. Frame conversations so they do not sprawl into chaos. Replace defensiveness with curiosity where possible. Approach hard talks with timing, clarity, and respect. And above all, remember that every conversation is training. The next one is shaping who you are becoming. If there is one reason this book has connected with so many readers, it is probably this. It does not promise mastery over other people. It promises greater stewardship over yourself. That is a much more honest promise. You cannot control whether someone listens well, apologizes sincerely, responds maturely, or changes at all. But you can change the quality of the presence you bring. You can stop pouring gasoline on moments that already have enough heat. You can stop mistaking speed for strength and apology for kindness and dominance for confidence. You can become clearer, steadier, and more connected, one conversation at a time. And that makes this book feel both practical and hopeful. It is not asking for a new personality. It is asking for a new discipline. The deepest insight running through the entire summary is this: most life-changing communication does not happen in speeches, negotiations, or public triumphs. It happens in kitchens, offices, bedrooms, cars, text threads, and conference rooms. In the ordinary spaces where people either repeat old patterns or interrupt them. Fisher believes interruption is possible. Not interruption in the rude sense, but in the transformational sense. You can interrupt the inherited argument style. You can interrupt the defensive reflex. You can interrupt the people-pleasing script. You can interrupt the urge to score points and instead move toward clarity, courage, and connection. That is why the title works so well. The next conversation really can become the hinge point. Not because every conversation will end beautifully, but because every one is a chance to practice a better self. If this summary gave you something useful, support the channel by liking, sharing, and commenting. It helps more thoughtful viewers find this kind of work, and it helps us keep creating deep, high-quality summaries instead of shallow clips. And for one final closing thought, the next conversation is best read not as a promise that conflict disappears, but as a reminder that conflict can become cleaner, calmer, and more honest when your inner state stops fighting your own values. You do not need the perfect line. You need a better posture. You need to know what you stand for. You need to slow down enough to hear what is really being said. And you need the courage to believe that your next words matter. See you in the next summary.